Hello and welcome to this NZ-US Council podcast. I'm Jordan Small. Today I'm bringing you a discussion I had earlier on today with Martjin Rasser and Ainikki Riikonen from the US think tank, the Center for a New American Security. They are co-authors of a recent report titled Common Code, an Alliance Framework for Democratic Technology Policy, which really advances that much talked about idea of the need for the world's democratic nations to work together on technology policy. Their report is one among a number of proposals currently out there from the US, Australia, India, the EU, and a number of other nations. All of these proposals highlight the central position of technology in foreign policy, national security, and geopolitical tensions. They describe in their report that the global order is at an inflection point where decisions made by world leaders in coming months will shape the world for decades. The liberal democracies, if they fail to come together, will miss the bus, and with it the ability to shape how emerging technologies such as AI, quantum computing, biotech, and communications will be used. However, in this case, missing the bus it doesn't mean a period of inaction or simply waiting for the next bus to come. It actually means ceding the ground to authoritarian nations like China, Russia, Iran, North Korea, Venezuela, who are working together to decide how these technologies will be used for everyone. And you don't need a crystal ball to see what that kind of future looks like. You only have to look to how these technologies, such as facial recognition, voice recognition, are being rolled out in Xinjiang and Hong Kong for the purposes of mass surveillance to quell protest and dissent. This is an incredibly frightening and deeply concerning situation. It is not something we can sit on the sidelines on. A response is required, a collective response, and that is where this proposal comes in, plus a number of others, for like-minded democratic nations to work together for the benefit of all. Ad hoc, reactive, one-off responses from individual nations advances nothing. A joined-up approach among nations with shared values and vision is needed. This report, Martjin and Ainikki being two of the co-authors, represents progress on the idea, and we congratulate them for their work and contribution to this important developing area. Martjin Rasser and Ainikki Riikonen, you'll find the detailed bios in the notes, are from the Technology and National Security Program at the Center for a New American Security, that's CNAS. And we pick up the conversation with me asking them to provide the lay of the land on these technology issues before getting into the specifics and mechanics of their proposal. The place I want to start is, it's almost like a context or scene setting segment, which is to have more of a general discussion on technology and provide the background or backdrop to your report. And like I mentioned in the intro, look at the central role of technology in geopolitical competition and the different forms and forums that competition is playing out. So Martjin, do you want to start with just that sort of broad outline?
Yeah, absolutely. So yeah, you said it well, right? We're in this geopolitical, geostrategic competition. Technology is very much at the center of this competition. If you think of technology as an enabler for political, military, economic power, it's really fundamental to how the 21st century is going to play out. I think technology will play a more consequential role than it has in times past. And now we're in this interesting geostrategic context where, power is more diffused. Unlike in the Cold War, China is a very formidable competitor in the sense that it has a lot of economic clout, and it's a very capable actor in the technology sphere as well. In addition to the ideological component that it brings to bear, and the whole reason why we started looking at this concept of an enlightened framework for technology policy is because we felt that the way the United States, as well as other liberal democracies such as New Zealand, our allies and partners in Europe and in East Asia, we just weren't approaching these issues very effectively. Like, our response is largely disjointed and stovepiped. So we feel there's got to be a better way to approach these issues. And ultimately, when you look at the scale that China can bring to bear to these issues, the only effective response to that is for like-minded countries like New Zealand and the United States to work together and think smarter and be more proactive about these issues. I think 5G is a great example of how things could have been better, right? The lessons learned from the 5G experience, I think, are very important, not just for future telecommunications technologies, but you can apply a lot of those lessons to a whole range of technology areas. And so that ultimately is the fundamental premise on which we based our work. As far as the project itself went, we formally launched it in March of this year. We engaged the Mercator Institute for China Studies in Germany and the Asia Pacific Initiative based in Japan as partners in this, because we wanted to ensure that we had stakeholders from all the relevant countries, but also make sure that we have stakeholders from all the segments of society that play a role with this, in particular, strong emphasis on private industry, because a lot of the recommendations that we make in our report are going to affect companies directly. And in order to be able to effectively execute a lot of the things that we propose, you have to work hand in glove with companies in order to plan this out, to do it in a way that is effective and efficient, but also doesn't destroy their innovative capacity and doesn't impair their bottom line too much. So that, in a nutshell, is the premise of the project and how we approached it. But let me turn it over to Ainikki so she can fill in some of the details.
Thanks, Martin. And obviously, as a co-author, I must agree with everything that you just said. I would also add, we're at an interesting pivotal point in emerging technologies. We don't know exactly what the future holds for AI, for biotech, for 5G, but some of the trends we're seeing is that, maybe it's not enough for governments to just take a totally hands-off approach or let it be totally fractured, because we are seeing some foreign governments having a pretty hands-on approach. For instance, China had its Belt and Road Initiative very famously, but then expanded into the digital Silk Road, and they've laid out, these intelligence laws that basically mean that 5G vendors might not be super separated from the government, right? And so you're definitely seeing foreign governments, potentially adversaries, authoritarian regimes, really starting to spread out worldwide. And I think there's not really been a good response from democracies. And this is really something we have to work together on in areas like standard setting or building the norms for, how networks or surveillance technologies or any other technology ought to be used. And I think it's good for our security and our prosperity too, to really work together on this.
Yeah, could you perhaps talk a little bit more about how we are seeing autocracies cooperating? So we're seeing China and Russia in particular. How are they coordinating around their vision for technology?
So first off, I have to give a shout out to my colleague, Kara Frederick, who I think is really leading the way for us in terms of that sort of digital freedom portfolio of research. But you're definitely seeing more of an authoritarian model emerging, where these emerging technology tools are really tools for them to consolidate their power. And in a way that we're not seeing in democracies, how can we use these tools to strengthen democracy or empower people instead? I think we're seeing with AI in particular, with data, what you put in is what you get out, right? And so if you put in bad practices, you get bad practices out, which I think takes a little bit more time for us to refine in a way that's a bit more equitable to people. But I think authoritarian regimes are not so shy to just, go out there and use these things.
Yeah. Martjin, do you want to add anything in there? Particularly interested in the use of sort of international standard setting forums around technology use.
Absolutely. Yeah. This is a really big issue, and one we address in the report as well. So what China and Russia are doing, they're really trying to shape the international environment in ways that is beneficial to their economic and political models. And this is, a direct threat to liberal democratic values and to our individual democratic countries. And for instance, in the United Nations, China has been very effective, as well as Russia has been very effective in shaping the norms for cyberspace, for example, in a way that benefits their regimes. We're seeing this happen more and more in other standard-setting bodies. Again, and 5G was a good example of how the Chinese Communist Party is using these standard-setting bodies as a way to push Chinese standards as to become global standards. And this affords their companies a lot of advantages in the international marketplace. But more importantly, to the point that Ainikki was making earlier, it also makes it easier for authoritarian regimes to export the ethical and legal frameworks for the use of technology. Now, we already see firsthand what China is doing in Xinjiang and in Hong Kong, but increasingly those same practices are being exported to other countries. There was just a press report the other day about the government of Uganda using Chinese surveillance technology to crack down on government opposition figures. This has happened in Nigeria. It constantly happens in Venezuela, and there's numerous examples of this going on around the world. China right now is paying particular attention to Southeast Asia, and I think this is, in particular, one area that will start affecting New Zealand more and more directly, because now it's in your backyard. And if this goes unchecked, this will pose significant problems to the world's democracies, because it starts chipping away at very fragile democratic institutions around the world. And increasingly, that poses a direct threat to our own democratic values, because you create this bifurcation in the technology sphere from that regard. So one of the ways we see a technology alliance working together is to build that solid foundation of norms and standards for technology, how technologies should and should not be used, and then use that common understanding as a springboard to have those norms become the global norms. And I think based on all the discussions that we had during the workshops for this project, that is really an area that is of great interest to all the proposed member countries, and an area where there's also a lot of urgency to act. So if an organization like this were to take shape in the next year or so, I would expect that to be one of the top priority areas for action.
What is the state of the race on multiple technology fronts at the moment? I mean, is the game already over? Like, if you think about sort of facial and voice recognition, 5G technology, digital payments, quantum communications, commercial drone market, all widely considered the Chinese are leading in those areas. Perhaps the US is ahead in some technologies such as AI and semiconductor production. What is it that gives you hope that that the US can step back up?
I mean, I think as they say, the best time to plant a tree is 50 years ago, and the second best time is now. And so I think now is an interesting turning point, especially looking at the pandemic as well. It's really exposed some of the brittleness and the vulnerability of supply chains, whether that's in medical equipment or, in semiconductors. We've seen hits to the electronics market because of it. And so I think there is an impetus for states to at least, look to each other and see how can we make these systems a little bit more resilient as we're learning more about human rights abuses in Xinjiang and elsewhere that are done through, high-tech means. What is the alternative proposition? And so, I think it's not necessarily even about being a race so much as there's progress, technology is going forward. And how do we go from here? So, I think it's not as valuable to look over our shoulders, but there's a lot of good work we can do now.
In the report, you describe right at the front of the report that the global order is at an inflection point. And you say where decisions made by world leaders in coming months will shape the world for decades. Specifically, what are you talking about here? What are some of those key decisions to be made?
I think it fundamentally boils down to how the United States and its allies and partners respond to China's erosion of the post-war system that was built, right? The multilateral institutions that were set up after the Second World War are being co-opted by the Chinese Communist Party, and in part due to lack of engagement and leadership by the United States. Beijing made some considerable headway there. Now, I think with an incoming Biden administration, things will look very differently very soon. If you look at some of the appointments that have already been made for some key national security positions, I would say that America is back and ready to lead, but it can only do so in concert with like-minded countries around the world. A lot of the multilateral organizations that are in existence today, part of the decision that needs to happen is how do you best navigate this new era of strategic competition, specifically the technology competition? A lot of these multilateral entities were created in a pre-digital age, and they are not fit and built to be able to deal with the problems that we're facing. So one of the key decisions is what new types of entities do you have to create in order to navigate this competition effectively? And of course, we feel that something along the lines of a technology alliance will be needed in order to do that effectively. What's particularly encouraging is that you're starting to see a lot of people come up with very similar ideas. And, by no means were we the first to propose something along these lines. I think the one difference that we bring to the table is we've really focused on the nuts and bolts of what this organization should look like, how it should function on a day-to-day basis. But the basic premise of the world's democracies working together more closely on issues like this is something that has been popping up in numerous countries. Most recently, just today, I think the EU released a document talking about their proposal for a trade and technology council, a form of technology alliance between the European Union and the United States. The Brits proposed the Democracy 10, which would be 10 democratic nations working together primarily on 5G, but also other technology issues. And there's a few other similar proposals out there. Even the Clean Network Initiative that the U.S. State Department put forward is another example of these types of approaches. And so these are the types of decisions that we were referring to in the introduction to the report, where how you approach these problems, what countries you engage with to tackle these problems, and how you position yourself vis-a-vis the leading autocratic countries in this regard, that's going to have tremendous impact on how this century shapes ultimately, because all these issues of technology are so infused into our everyday lives and the trajectory of our economies, the overall well-being of our nations in terms of national security and so forth. It's such a fundamental issue that, again, things that we're going to be discussing and deciding in the next 6 to 12 months will be living the consequences of that 20, 30, 40 years down the road. I see this as a very similar point to the decisions that were made at Bretton Woods, for example, in 1944, which laid out the architecture for the global economic system. I think it's this type of magnitude that we're talking about, given what's at stake.
Yeah, you mentioned it, Martin, about the increase of these kinds of proposals. And I guess I have a question, which is, is the WTO and the OECD just not places where these things are going to get resolved? And I'm pretty sure what your answer will be there. And the second thing is, how do you see all these different proposals? There's the UK at the Tech 10. You've got the Common Code 10. How do you see them knitting together, and what's the most effective way of that happening?
Yeah, that's an important question. I wouldn't say that existing organizations like the WTO and the OECD are by no means irrelevant. There are changes that need to be made, particularly to the WTO, for example. But one of the recommendations we make for this tech alliance is that it has a capacity to work with other countries, but also other organizations that aren't within this core group. So the OECD, for example, would be a tremendous partner to work on standards and norms for artificial intelligence. There's other existing organizations that can work on bits and pieces, but in order to approach the broader technology policy issues holistically, there's no existing organization that can tackle this. And that's why we feel that creating the new entity is the best way forward. Now, as you mentioned, yes, there's various proposals out there. There's some differences in approach, membership, and so forth. So yeah, now it's a matter of sitting down with the relevant countries and hammering out the details. What we wanted to do with our report was to give people something to react to so that policymakers have something to discuss and debate, as opposed to having to start from scratch and thinking about, well, who should be a part of this? How should we organize ourselves? By giving people something as a foundation to work with, we hope that we can, advance the debate such that an organization like this could be set up much faster than would be otherwise. By and large, I think there's considerable overlap, and views are starting to coalesce on where that common ground is. So my hope is that policymakers can get something like this going in fairly short order, now that you have Americans, Australians, Japanese, and Europeans all coming up with pretty similar ideas, using that as momentum to have some really concrete discussions in 2021, hopefully get something off the ground even before the year is out. But let me turn to Ainikki, because I know she has some thoughts on this point as well.
Absolutely. And I think, to me, it's a wonderful coincidence that the groupings everyone is proposing vary slightly, but it seems to revolve around this, magic number 10. And I think for us, part of the reason we stuck to such a short list was that we want this grouping to be really agile and also flexible. Obviously, the rate of technology innovation is pretty immense. And so you do, I think, need a grouping of countries that can, sit down and talk amongst each other and reach some kind of consensus pretty quickly as they go through their decision-making processes. And again, obviously wanting to implement that flexibility. And so maybe you'll loop in, for instance, Estonia on cybersecurity initiatives, or Sweden and Finland on 5G. So certainly the core grouping of 10, but not limited to the 10.
So, how did you set that criteria for core membership. And where does it leave countries such as New Zealand, who are small but have a long democratic tradition and a growing technology sector with strong links to the US, and are vulnerable to economic coercion from big players such as China? So where does a small nation like New Zealand fit within your framework?
Yeah, it was one of the most difficult things that we had to tackle in this project, was ultimately deciding who would we propose as being core members. So the criteria we used were, a large economy, a significant broad-based technological capability, and obviously liberal democratic values as being at the core of their governance system. So in this particular case, we're recommending the G7 countries plus South Korea, Australia, and the Netherlands, as well as the EU as a non-voting member. And as Ainikki mentioned before, we wanted to do this because we believe a small size is necessary in order for this grouping to still be nimble in its decision making. That's also the reason why the EU would be a non-voting member, just because if you have 27 countries weighing in addition to the others, we're fearful that it would get bogged down. Now, in terms of that, obviously leaves out some very important countries, India being one of them, a country like Israel, Brazil, and then, of course, smaller democratic partners and allies like New Zealand. So in order to address that, we wanted to make sure that there was a mechanism to engage with other countries. And this is what Ainikki mentioned as well. So for specific technology areas, but also the norms issue, which has a much larger audience of relevant countries, that you could bring in other countries to work on these issues. So norms, cyberspace, I think, would be one where you would have a very large grouping. But there's other areas like semiconductors, for example, where it would just be a small handful. So it wouldn't make sense to have a very large group focus on that. So overall, the focus is on nimbleness and flexibility, so that you can adapt and adjust the grouping according to the specific topic that these countries are looking at. That ultimately, I think, will help it to establish itself, prove that this concept can work. Now, over time, we do foresee the desirability of expanding that core group. I think New Zealand would be a logical candidate. India, for example, is a huge technology power. And frankly, at this point, I would argue that India would make sense to be a part of the core group at the outset. Just an interesting aside on that, when we first started the project, the Indian diplomats in Washington that we spoke with weren't all that keen on the idea, in part because they didn't want to be antagonistic toward China. Now, in the intervening months, of course, that dynamic between India and China has changed considerably. India is much more assertive about blocking Chinese firms from its economy. It's engaging much more with the Quad. And so now I think India would be very much open to joining a grouping like this from day one. So just in the span of 9 months, that whole dynamic has changed. And even going forward, like all the recommendations we make, I don't want to give the impression that this document is rigid and set in stone. I see this as an iterative process and a living, breathing document. And so, yes, if countries around the world are serious about making this happen, then absolutely, let's invite New Zealand and Israel to join the discussions at the outset and see what we can do. And if it makes sense to build that grouping a little larger than what we propose now, as long as everyone is willing to agree to do what the group as a whole wants to do, it can work, but it shouldn't come at the expense of the flexibility in decision making. I think that's ultimately most important to prove the concept.
I think the one of the principles of democracy is that all voices count, big and small, and the fact that we're one of the oldest democracies functioning in the world and the oldest universal suffrage democracy, we like to have a seat at the table at the beginning for any of these kinds of initiatives. But let's not continue that, because that's it's not a big issue, I don't think, in terms of what you're trying to advocate for. And you talked about the flexibility of it. But there's huge debates going on internally inside the 10 countries that you have identified, where they can't even agree on privacy at the moment. So, for example, California's got a privacy law around the internet, and the federal government hasn't really caught up, and it may catch up under a Biden administration. But do you see that getting domestic coherence is going to be key to getting a plurilateral approach to this from the democracies?
Yeah, I think a certain amount of harmonization will be necessary in order for something like this to work. But I think if we focus on the areas where we all agree, those shared values that liberal democratic countries have, yeah, that's a great starting point. And as you mentioned, even within the United States, there's a lot of different opinions about what the proper way forward is. But that also points to the strength of democracies, right? Where you can have these debates in the open and have them be constructive, and certain influences will wax and wane. And that's a sharp contrast to a country like China or Russia, where those debates don't happen at all. It's whatever the leadership in the capital says it is. I think a very important development is that EU proposal that I mentioned earlier. That document seems to suggest that they are willing to compromise with the United States on some of these issues, on matters of data protection, data privacy, and the role of the big tech companies in this ecosystem. At the same time, with an incoming Biden administration, I think there will be very much a willingness to have these types of discussions. Now, granted, will there be full agreement? Probably not. But just the fact that people want to sit at the table and start talking through these issues is a very important step forward. And so for all those reasons, I'm quite optimistic that we'll see some considerable movement in the right direction on a lot of these issues in coming months.
So we've kind of talked a little bit around compromise to achieve this kind of grand bargain. And the 10 nations likely on set are very diverse with a range of interests. Where do you see the US giving in order to get? So, would you expect to see compromise in the area like free speech standards or privacy standards, taxation of US tech giants? Where do you see some of that compromise happening?
I think areas like taxation, regulation are areas where I think there's room for discussion and some harmonization. Matters of free speech, I think, is probably not in the cards, just because of our First Amendment is so fundamentally important. So I don't see much happening on that front. But again, even under the Trump administration, there was some compromise that happened, right? Because the United States ended up joining the global partnership on AI. They were hemming and hawing on this for many months. But as they saw the other countries in that partnership move forward, they didn't want to get left out and left behind. So even under the Trump administration, there were pragmatic voices that realized that you had to step back from certain extreme positions because ultimately, there's more than unites us than divides us on a lot of these issues. And given the particular threat that China poses, the challenge that it poses, everything that you see happening now in Australia, for example, what country is going to be next, right? And how do we respond to that? I think the best way to do that is to create that united front. And in doing so, yes, ultimately you have to compromise some, but in the bigger picture, you get out a lot more than you put in. And I think that's what policymakers in all the leading capitals are starting to realize, that it's really going to take something like this to move forward and actually be able to navigate this competition effectively.
In terms of the initial agenda for the alliance, what are the 3 or 4 kind of first up wins the alliance needs to see?
One of the happy surprises we had when we had our workshops to really put together the content of this report was that there are a lot of areas where there's already some alignment. And so we really tried to capitalize on those in our recommendations. And some of those include, restructuring supply chains in a way that's more secure, finding ways to protect technology. As we all know, it's no secret, China has, really systematic way of stealing different people's stuff, which I'm sure we can all agree we don't love. Ways of aligning standards for putting out digital infrastructure, whether that's 5G or other networks, bringing integrity back to the standard setting process, and then really looking at the norms and values for the way we use technologies. And so these are areas where we're already having lots of conversation. I think there's more alignment than not. And so these are the areas we propose as the quote unquote easy wins up front.
Do you have anything to add there, Martjin?
I think, those are indeed the ones that we recommend. I'm particularly excited about the prospect of supply chain security issues. And this is an area, particularly in the pandemic fallout, that a lot of countries realized how vulnerable we really are. So introducing geographic diversification for certain key inputs is going to be a big agenda item, and particularly for the United States, it already is, right, with this economic prosperity network that was launched. It's unclear how far along that is. I think the U.S. State Department has been a little opaque as to what they've achieved on that front. But this is something I would expect the Biden administration to focus very heavily on. We already talked about the norms. I think that truly is low-hanging fruit. And the other thing that I think holds a lot of potential is creating new investment mechanisms for digital infrastructure, particularly if you look at the Indo-Pacific, especially Southeast Asia. China is pushing very hard on setting up digital infrastructure. If you think about smart cities, for example, that could pose some considerable problems for New Zealand, Australia, down the road. So this is another area where I think with some cooperative action, we can really make a difference in short order by providing countries like Indonesia with good alternatives to Chinese technology.
Yeah. What do you think is the easiest thing to achieve in the short term between an alliance of democracies that gets us on the road to further more and more integration of our policies?
I think one kind of interesting area, and Martin, I don't know if you also want to touch on this, but is aligning export controls. Here in the US, we've seen a lot of ad hoc decision making. But one thing that seems a little bit steadier is a growing interest in protecting human rights around the use of technology. And so under the Trump administration, you've seen a number of companies get added to the entity list. But some of the issue is that if the U.S. unilaterally, puts in controls, all of a sudden there's questions about what does this mean for the advantage of other states, or can some of these entities then just go around the U.S. and go other places to buy the things they need to keep doing the human rights abuses, whether that's surveillance tech or otherwise. And so I think. To me, this seems like one of the more straightforward areas in terms of saying, we do not want to be complicit in providing the tools for these abuses. And so I think that's one interesting area of agreement.
Yeah, I think that's a really good area. I think the New Zealand companies report to us that they really struggle with the operation of export controls in the United States and how they impact their operations here. And so there's probably, through alignment work and being more practical about how those are implemented, there could be a lot more export control work done on things like human rights, as you've laid out. So that would be a very fruitful area that would do two things: would address the things like you've laid out, like human rights and national security, but it also could lead to greater two-way trade or greater trade between the democracies on these with these technologies.
Yeah. So, the other area that's talked about is just information sharing on supply chains and supply chain risks and, investment assessments, and making sure there's the sharing of that sort of information between countries. Do you have a comment on that?
Yeah, absolutely. I think better cooperation on investment screening, so looking at foreign direct investment and potential risks that those pose. Each country has a range of experiences on that, and it makes complete sense to share what they know and what some best practices are. There's a lot of opportunity in cyberspace, for example. I think in particular, if you have a large group of like-minded countries come up with normative frameworks for what is appropriate and inappropriate behavior in cyberspace, that sends a powerful message, because then you have a good springboard to be able to have those norms become global norms. As far as other protective actions against unwanted tech transfer, just better information sharing on counterintelligence and counter-espionage best practices. I think in particular, you already have the Five Eyes relationship. That's an excellent foundation for enhanced cooperation with other countries. And, Japan in particular is very eager to play a greater role, but the same goes for many other countries as well. And that's something that has a lot of second and third order benefits, because unwanted tech transfer coming out of Germany also affects the New Zealand economy in a certain way. It affects the American economy. So having increased dialogue on those fronts, I think, is another, as Ainikki put it, an easy win for these countries to start showing some real impact and just building that trust that you need for collaboration on more challenging issues.
Yeah. I think the big ambitious goal I saw there was around coordination of investments and almost an industrial planning happening between the partners. We are talking about the rationalization, allocation of resources for innovation and research and development. Can you just talk us through what your thinking is there?
Yeah, absolutely. So this is, definitely one of the longer-term goals, specifically for the reasons that you mentioned, right? It's there's a lot of hurdles to doing so, but there's good opportunities available, particularly if you start thinking about green energy technologies. There's a lot of room for collaborative work there. But some of the more complex issues in artificial intelligence would make a lot of sense. But even more pragmatically, if you think about critical minerals such as rare earth elements, right now, all our economies are heavily dependent on Chinese sources of rare earths and almost entirely dependent on China for the processing. So some of the countries in the grouping that we propose have areas of expertise in mining, processing, recycling. There's a lot of work that we can do together in order to build up capacities and truly create new supply chains. But that will require a lot of investment, and will also require these countries to work together to essentially, because then you're countering Chinese industrial policy, because Beijing's reaction undoubtedly will be to drive the price of these materials down so that the non-Chinese companies go belly up. The same playbook that they've done in aluminum and steel, for example, solar panels. So it would take some kind of industrial policy or technology policy, whatever you want to call it, that these countries agree to in order to make an effort like that viable. So yes, it's a shift in how we've been thinking about our market economies over the past 40, 50 years. But given the nature of the China challenge, at a minimum, it's a discussion we need to have amongst each other to see, if we can find a comfort zone for all these countries to be able to work together on issues like this. So truly fresh thinking about these problems, given the unique nature of the competition that we're in.
Yeah. So we're fast approaching the end of our hour. Leon, do you have one final question before we wrap up?
No, I think the work you're doing is absolutely crucial, and there's no shortage of really excellent thinking coming out of the United States and the UK and Canada as well, and doing some thinking about it. I think the question that I would have is, how soon do you think these ideas will get traction?
If you look at some of the writings of the president-elect himself, but in particular some of his senior advisors and now nominees for important positions, such as Tony Blinken, Jake Sullivan, they're talking a lot about these issues in a way that I think dovetail nicely with the types of ideas that we put forward in our report, as well as the other proposals that are out there, such as the Democracy 10. So in terms of a philosophical approach, I think, yes, the Biden administration is very much interested in rebuilding alliances, rebuilding the partnerships, but also taking multilateral approaches to the types of issues that we've been discussing now. So I do expect to see strong momentum behind this as soon as the new administration is in place. Hopefully by early spring, we'll see signs out in the public domain that, yes, these discussions are happening. And I would expect, the leaders in New Zealand and Japan and Western Europe to be getting phone calls from Biden administration officials to initiate discussions along these lines. And of course, it's great to see that other countries are thinking the very same thing, right? With the Quad looking at tech policy, the ideas coming out of Brussels and London. So I think all in all, the signs are pointing to some interesting developments along these lines happening in the not too distant future.
That was Martjin Rasser and Ainikki Riikonen of the Center for New American Security. This was an edited version of our discussion. You can find the full discussion on our YouTube account, a little laggy, but definitely unedited. I'll include the details in the notes. That's another episode done. Don't forget to subscribe, Apple, Spotify, Google, wherever you listen to your podcasts, and send me an email with any feedback or questions on the episode or podcast. Thanks again. I'm Jordan Small. Join us next time for this NZ US Council Download.